Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the buzzing streets of ancient Rome, where the smell of roasted chestnuts mixes with the clatter of sandals on stone, and your eyes snag on something unsettling. Rows of people standing on wooden platforms, each one with a price tag dangling like a sad little sales sticker. This isn't your local farmer's market. You're staring at human beings, priced the way you might compare melons. It's jarring, it's uncomfortable, and let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in this scene without blurting out something sarcastic that got you whipped or worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing just how far across the world these late-night history journeys stretch. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The shocking part is that not every slave in Rome cost the same. Prices swung wildly depending on what you wanted, the same way the cost of a car today changes depending on whether you're eyeing a used hatchback or a brand new luxury ride. A strong, unskilled farm laborer could go for a few hundred denarii, roughly a few $1,000s in modern equivalents, though historians still argue whether such conversions ever make sense. Meanwhile, a trained Greek tutor, someone who could teach your kids rhetoric and philosophy, might sell for the equivalent of a suburban mansion. You shuffle closer, squinting at the chalk marks on a slave's board hung around their neck. Some details are proudly written: skills, language ability, age, health. Others are hidden like a suspicious limp or a nasty temper. Roman buyers weren't dumb. They kicked metaphorical tires and checked teeth before sealing the deal. Think of it like a bizarre mix between an auction and a job interview. Except, the applicant didn't get a say. One mainstream fact here. During the late Republic and early Empire, a typical slave's price was often around 500 denarii, while highly skilled individuals might fetch 10 to 20 times that. Senators could drop fortunes on an exotic dancer or a particularly beautiful servant, not because they needed one, but because showing off was half the point. Owning expensive slaves was like flexing a sports car in your driveway. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Sellers sometimes dyed a slave's hair or smeared them with makeup to boost appeal, like dressing up a display model. Imagine walking past someone who's been powdered and perfumed like a showroom doll, and you realize it's all sales tactics. The Romans were masters of marketing before Mad Men was even a twinkle in history's eye. Of course, not all slaves were equal investments. A mine worker was basically a disposable tool, bought cheaply and often dead within a few years. A secretary, fluent in Greek and Latin though, could last decades, earning their owner more wealth. You notice how the math works out. The real price wasn't just the purchase, but the return on that investment. Historians still argue whether these price differences reflect supply and demand in a modern sense, or whether they were more about social display. Was a Greek tutor really worth that much more? Or was he just a convenient bragging accessory for the Roman elite? Picture yourself fumbling coins at the market stall, wondering if you'd be a bargain bin buy or a luxury splurge. Judging by how quickly you burn through your grocery budget today, you're probably leaning toward the clearance rack. Don't worry, you'd have company. Many thousands of slaves were bought cheap and put straight into grueling work. The silence between platform calls is heavy. Somewhere, a crier announces the going rate, voice echoing through the stone-lined square. Buyers mutter, counting their sesterces. You catch a whiff of sweat, dust, maybe fear, and it hits you. Every price shouted here is a number stamped over a life story. Someone's son, someone's daughter, someone with a favorite childhood snack, now reduced to an auctioneer's chant. And yet, as you glance at the wealthier Romans strutting with pride after a purchase, you realize the economy of empire depended on this. Millions of lives, bought and sold, kept the wheels of Rome turning. Villas ran on it, farms thrived on it, armies rewarded themselves with it. Even if you wanted to opt out, if you lived in Rome, you benefited indirectly from the labor of those bought at these platforms. The more you listen, the more the numbers blur, until you hear the rhythm of trade: 500 denarii, 1,000, 2,000. Each one snapping into your ears like the beep of a cash register. The market hums and you can almost imagine the neon glow of a modern shopping mall. Only here, the products don't sit on shelves. They stand under the sun, shifting uncomfortably, knowing their future's about to be sold away. You step back, thinking about the absurd extremes. A gladiator in peak condition could fetch tens of thousands of denarii, a gamble that he'd win crowds and betting money. On the flip side, a criminal condemned to the mines might be tossed in almost free because his life expectancy was shorter than a modern goldfish's attention span. The Romans were practical, cold, and sometimes shockingly generous, depending on who you were and how you could serve them. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you hear a cheeky voice whisper, "If humans had price tags today, would you splurge on charisma, sarcasm, or dishwasher loading skills?" Don't answer that. It's late, and you'll only start side-eyeing your roommates. As twilight settles over the Roman square, torches flicker against the stone, and the last sales of the day wrap up. A boy is led away by a stern-faced master, while a finely dressed matron counts out coins for a girl she intends to train as a lady's maid. The market closes, but the hum of commerce never really ends. Tomorrow there will be more arrivals, more price tags, and more whispered bargains. And you, standing there, realize you've just glimpsed the economic engine that drove the ancient world. A world where the worth of a human was measured not in love, but in silver. The torches fade behind you as you shuffle toward the outskirts of the city, where the real story begins. Where did all these people actually come from? You glance back at the market stalls in your memory, the rows of blank faces waiting to be sold, and it dawns on you. Rome didn't have a special slave factory churning out human beings on conveyor belts. No, the empire's supply chain was war, piracy, and, in some cases, people so desperate they literally sold themselves or their children. Cheery bedtime thought, right? The biggest source by far was conquest. Every time a Roman legion stomped across a border and planted its eagle standard, captives followed behind in chains. Picture the aftermath of a battle. Roman soldiers celebrating victory, wagons creaking with loot, and behind them entire families trudging along as spoils of war. You probably wouldn't survive that march either. You'd complain once about the lack of coffee stops, and some centurion would silence you permanently. One mainstream fact: after the conquest of Gaul under Julius Caesar, it's said that hundreds of thousands of Gauls were enslaved and shipped south into Italy. Think about that. An entire population vacuumed up, parceled out, and sold into villas, fields, and mines. Rome wasn't just absorbing territory, it was harvesting people. And yet, not all slaves arrived via glorious battlefield drama. Piracy was another big funnel. The Mediterranean was so plagued with pirate raids at times that coastal towns lived in constant fear. Pirates weren't just after shiny loot. They specialized in grabbing people, young and old, and selling them into slavery at coastal markets. Imagine chilling on a beach holiday and suddenly being bundled into a boat. Goodbye sunscreen, hello shackles. That was a very real possibility around the 2nd century BCE, until Pompey the Great launched a campaign to clear out pirate strongholds. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some pirates were so professional that they basically offered tiers of captivity. Wealthy victims could send for ransom, while less fortunate souls were quickly sold into slavery. Think of it as a terrifying version of today's economy seats versus first-class options. And of course, Rome, being Rome, often bought up these discount captives, turning someone's seaside nightmare into a farmer's new labor supply. But here's where it gets darker. Sometimes slavery wasn't forced at sword point. In times of famine or financial ruin, people actually sold themselves or their children into slavery. It sounds unthinkable, but if your family was starving and slavery in a wealthy household meant at least food and shelter, the cruel math started to make sense. Historians still argue whether this voluntary slavery counts as a choice or simply as coercion in disguise. After all, what kind of freedom do you really have when your kids are starving? You follow an imaginary caravan down dusty roads, hearing chains rattle like a grim soundtrack. Some captives speak Greek, others Celtic, others Eastern tongues. Rome was a melting pot because it stole the ingredients. You overhear one soldier bragging about how many captives his unit captured after a skirmish in Dacia. Another grumbles that the best-looking ones were taken by the generals as personal spoils. It's like an ugly draft system, where beauty and youth often meant a more valuable fate, though not necessarily a kinder one. In the city itself, slave dealers worked like middlemen, buying bulk from military commanders and reselling them in lots. You imagine yourself standing in front of a warehouse, its wooden doors flung open to reveal huddled masses. The smell hits you first: sweat, fear, and maybe the faint tang of seawater from a recent voyage. And inside, traders tally heads as casually as if they're counting jars of olive oil. And if you're thinking, well, maybe there were limits, here's the spoiler. Not really. Rome's hunger for slaves was insatiable. Even laws against kidnapping Roman citizens, yes, it did happen, barely slowed the market. Rome needed bodies to till fields, cook dinners, tutor children, and haul stone for grand construction projects. Supply had to come from somewhere, and Rome was not picky. There's an almost surreal quality to it all. One day you're a farmer in Thrace. The next day you're standing in a Roman square with a chalkboard around your neck. One day you're a Greek soldier who lost a battle. The next you're tutoring some senator's brat who refuses to memorize Cicero. The randomness of it is dizzying. You never knew when the tide of empire would sweep up your entire life and sell it to the highest bidder. Historians still argue about the exact proportions. Was it mostly war captives? Or did piracy and debt slavery contribute more than we realize? The records are patchy, and ancient writers weren't exactly keeping Excel spreadsheets of every sale. What's certain is that Rome's appetite for conquest fed its appetite for labor, and that cycle kept spinning for centuries. As the caravan disappears into the city gates, you feel a chill. You think of all those faces blending into Rome's daily life, each one with a story cut short. And the eerie part is how quickly they vanish into the background. Once inside the empire, the captives aren't Gauls, Greeks, or Syrians anymore. They're just property, labels stripped, identities reduced, new lives imposed. And yet, walking through Rome, you'd hear dozens of accents, see flashes of foreign jewelry, smell strange spices on kitchen fires, all little reminders that these commodities carried fragments of their homelands. The empire consumed people, but it also accidentally wove their cultures into its fabric. As the night air settles around you, you realize the price tags from earlier only tell half the story. The real cost of Roman slavery began long before the marketplace, with the clash of swords, the cry of pirates, or the desperate bargain of a starving family. Your sandals scrape over the cobblestones as you drift back into the city center, following the noise of hawkers, animals, and 1,000 conversations tumbling over each other. The Roman slave market isn't tucked away in some shady alley. It's right there in the bustle of public life, as ordinary as grabbing groceries or haggling for fish. You squeeze into the crowd, and suddenly you're at the epicenter of the most awkward shopping trip imaginable. Picture this: platforms lined up like miniature stages, each with a human being perched stiffly on top. Around their necks hang wooden placards scrawled with details: age, origin, skills, sometimes even personality traits like docile or hot-tempered. You try not to laugh, but honestly, it feels uncomfortably close to scrolling through dating profiles. Except here, swiping left isn't an option. One mainstream fact: by law, sellers in Rome were required to disclose any defects or diseases in a slave. If they didn't, and you bought someone with a hidden problem, you could demand your money back. Imagine returning a human being like a faulty toaster. It's chilling, yet in a bizarre way, it reveals how embedded consumer protection was. Even in the darkest corners of the economy, the noise is relentless. Auctioneers shout prices, buyers haggle, gesturing with dramatic sweeps of the arm. Slaves stand silent, eyes darting, knowing their future depends on how much silver someone's willing to part with. A boy coughs and a buyer scowls. A girl smiles politely, coached to look cheerful, because a cheerful face might mean a softer master. You feel the tension buzzing like static in the air. And because humans are humans, even in chains, there are sales tricks. Sellers sometimes oiled bodies to make muscles gleam under the sun, or placed children in matching outfits to make them look like cute sets. One quirky tidbit: buyers could test a slave's knowledge on the spot. Imagine being asked to recite a line of Homer or demonstrate your weaving skills in front of a restless crowd. Forget stage fright. You're literally auditioning for your life. You shuffle closer to an auction platform. The crier slaps a staff against the wood, calling out details. Male, 18, Gallic, strong arms, skilled in farming. The crowd murmurs, eyes narrowing, purses clinking with coins. The bidding begins. Voices rise, fast and sharp, like a game of verbal ping-pong. Within minutes, the boy is led away by his new owner, expression unreadable. Historians still argue whether these markets were primarily brutal spectacles or simply mundane parts of daily life. Was it a shocking carnival of suffering, or did Romans see it the way we see a car dealership? Loud, inconvenient, but ordinary? The truth may lie somewhere in between. You squeeze past a group of wealthy matrons, their jewelry clinking as they size up young women for household work. A senator strides by, eyeing potential tutors for his children, and in the corner, you spot a farmer counting and recounting his small stack of coins, trying to afford even one strong laborer for his fields. The market wasn't just for the elite, it served everyone from aristocrats to smallholders. Then the strangest sight, chalk lines drawn on the stones, marking areas for different categories. Skilled slaves here, children there, foreign captives in another section. It's organization at its coldest, like a human supermarket with aisles labeled for easy browsing. You think back to the endless big-box stores you've wandered in modern life, and the comparison sends a shiver down your spine. But the market wasn't always predictable. Sometimes bulk sales of captives arrived after a military campaign, flooding the city with so many people that prices plummeted. Picture a clearance sale where you could suddenly buy 3 farmhands for the price of 1. On other days, rare individuals, like a famous dancer or a particularly handsome youth, would draw bidding wars so intense you'd think they were auctioning off crown jewels. And then there's the part nobody wants to talk about: humiliation. Captives were often stripped naked to prove they had no hidden injuries or flaws. The crowd ogled, whispered, judged. Imagine being forced onto a stage, exposed to strangers, your body cataloged like merchandise. For Romans, it was practical. For us, it's gut-wrenching. You edge toward the side of the square, trying to shake off the unease. A jester juggles nearby, trying to lighten the mood for restless buyers. Children chase each other between the legs of grown men negotiating over human lives. The casualness is what really gets to you. Nobody here blinks. For Romans, this is Tuesday, and just when you think you've absorbed enough, you overhear 2 dealers arguing over the presentation of their captives. One insists that freshly bathed and perfumed slaves sell better. The other swears buyers care only about muscle tone and age. You chuckle quietly to yourself. This sounds suspiciously like modern real estate agents debating whether staging a house with cookies in the oven actually makes it sell faster. Some debates apparently never die. The auction continues, relentless. Coins clink, buyers depart, new captives shuffle forward. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, signaling that another caravan has just arrived at the city gates. Fresh stock ready to replenish the market. The cycle doesn't stop, it never stops. As twilight drapes over the square, torches flare to life. The crowd thins, but the chatter lingers in your ears. You glance back one last time, watching the platforms empty as purchased souls vanish into Roman streets. Some will end up in kitchens, some in fields, some in chains deep underground, and you, standing there in the shadows, can't shake the feeling that you've just walked through one of history's most unsettling shopping malls. The market square fades behind you, but the echoes of the auctioneer's voice still cling to your ears. Now you're following the footsteps of those newly purchased souls, heading not to freedom, but to their masters' homes, farms, or businesses. Buying a slave was only the first step. Like splurging on some expensive gadget, the real work began afterward. Owners had to train their human investment, molding them into the role they were expected to play. Imagine arriving at your new owner's villa, chains finally removed, but freedom still far away. The master looks you over, tapping his chin like he's inspecting a new horse. Do you look strong enough to swing a hoe? Graceful enough to pour wine at dinner parties? Intelligent enough to copy scrolls without smudging the ink? Whatever his judgment, your future bends in that direction. One mainstream fact: Roman owners often sent new slaves to specialized training schools. Gladiators went to Ludus schools to be hardened into fighters. Household slaves sometimes received instruction in etiquette, how to serve at banquets, how to stand silently in the corner until summoned. Even cooks might be trained by experts in the culinary arts, because a villa's reputation could rise or fall with the quality of its garum sauce. You glance around one of these training courtyards. A harsh overseer barks orders. Young boys practice pouring wine without spilling a drop, their hands trembling. Girls learn how to fold togas just so, with pleats neat enough to satisfy the pickiest matron. In another wing, scribes scratch wax tablets, copying lines over and over until the letters look clean. It's a school, yes, but one where the students don't get to dream about recess. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Roman households used punishment as teaching aids. If a servant spilled wine at dinner, the master might pour the rest over their head to drive the point home. Imagine turning clumsiness into an impromptu hair wash, and you'll see why slaves learned fast. And yet, the system wasn't only about discipline. Owners understood that a skilled slave was more valuable than an untrained one. They invested in education, especially for Greek slaves, who were prized for their knowledge of literature, philosophy, and rhetoric. A clever Greek tutor could raise the prestige of an entire family, teaching Roman children how to debate, compose poetry, or argue their way through politics. You stand in the doorway, watching a tired Greek scholar drill Latin verbs into the head of a yawning teenager, and you realize this is how Rome imported brilliance alongside brute labor. Still, not everyone was given a chance to shine. Many slaves were relegated to raw physical work, trained only in obedience. You picture a newly bought farmhand learning how to use Roman plows, their body aching as they're whipped into rhythm with the oxen, or a mine worker shoved underground, told once how to swing a pick, and then left to figure out survival on their own. The training here is less about skill, more about endurance. Historians still argue whether Roman training methods reflected genuine care for slaves or just cold economic pragmatism. Was an educated slave respected in some small way or simply viewed as a more expensive tool to be protected? The records leave us with only glimpses, hints scribbled in legal codes and household letters. Some households even branded their slaves with symbols of ownership, ensuring no one could mistake them for free citizens. You see the faint scar on a man's forehead as he bows his head, a permanent reminder that he belongs to someone else. For runaways, this mark was a curse. They could never blend in. For owners, it was reassurance that their property wouldn't vanish easily. Training also involved teaching loyalty, or at least compliance. A slave who resisted commands faced punishment, ranging from whippings to shackles. Yet over time, many learned to anticipate their master's moods, smoothing tempers before they flared. You can almost hear the whispered advice in the corridors. Never pour the wine too warm. Don't wake him before dawn. Compliment her jewels. Survival became an art form. And yes, Rome loved hierarchy, even among the enslaved. A trusted servant, once trained, could be promoted to oversee others, wielding a sliver of power. Imagine being a slave placed in charge of the kitchen, suddenly bossing around your fellow captives. It's a twisted game of divide and rule, one that kept rebellion at bay while squeezing more efficiency from the system. You wander past a villa's back courtyard and see it all in action. The cook scolding an apprentice for burning bread, the steward checking tallies of grain, the young maid nervously balancing a tray. None of them chose this life, yet here they are, drilled into roles that keep the household humming. And standing on the balcony, the master nods with satisfaction. His investment is paying off. Sometimes, though, training could flip a slave's fortunes. A particularly talented cook might become famous across the city, hired out to other villas for lavish banquets. A skilled secretary could gain enough influence to whisper advice in the ear of a senator. Training could raise your value, sometimes even paving the way toward eventual freedom. But that was a rare prize dangling just out of reach for most. As you leave the villa courtyard, the sounds of clattering trays and shouted lessons echo behind you. The slaves continue their rehearsals, perfecting the small details that make them useful, valuable, and, ironically, indispensable. The irony bites. The more skilled they became, the more tightly Rome clutched them. You step past the villa's outer gate, and suddenly find yourself gliding through the world where most trained slaves ended up. The inner machinery of domestic life. It's quieter here, but only in comparison to the clamor of markets and training yards. In truth, a Roman villa was a hive buzzing day and night, with slaves as the invisible gears keeping everything running smoothly. The kitchen greets you first, hot and smoky. A cook bends over a clay oven, stirring a pot of lentils while barking orders to assistants chopping vegetables. A boy fans the coals, sweat streaming down his brow, and you wonder how long before his arms give out. Dinner in a wealthy Roman household wasn't just food, it was theater. Every course had to impress, and every mistake could bring punishment. One mainstream fact: elite Romans loved elaborate meals that featured exotic imports like pepper from India or oysters from Britain. These dishes required slaves not only to cook, but also to source, prepare, and serve them with flawless timing. You edge around the smoky room, watching a young girl grind spices on a stone slab. The air is pungent, almost dizzying, and you can't help but sneeze. She stifles a laugh at your face but quickly ducks her head again. Humor wasn't exactly encouraged here. Still, that tiny flicker of humanity tells you she's not just a cog in the villa machine. Beyond the kitchen, you slip into the gardens. A gardener crouches near a fig tree, trimming branches with careful hands. Another tends rows of herbs destined for both medicine and cooking. The villa's beauty, its marble fountains, its shaded pergolas, isn't just for the owner's pride. It's crafted by dozens of unseen hands. You brush your fingers over a sprig of rosemary, and the fragrance clings to you like a quiet reminder that even beauty has a cost. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman villas often kept slaves who specialized in tending pet animals. Imagine being tasked with brushing your mistress's lapdog or feeding exotic birds imported from faraway provinces. It sounds cushy compared to hauling stone, but the stakes were high. If Fluffy didn't get his figs or if that parrot died, you'd be in serious trouble. You're suddenly grateful your only pet care responsibility is forgetting to water a succulent once in a while. Inside, the villa hums with more activity. In the atrium, a maid sweeps the marble floor until it gleams. Another polishes bronze lamps, her reflection flickering back at her in warped patterns. Slaves carry buckets of water from the cistern, refill oil lamps, arrange cushions just so. It's endless maintenance, invisible until it fails. Historians still argue whether Roman household slaves were better off compared to those in fields or mines. Some had relative comfort, even chances to learn trades or form families. Others lived under the thumb of capricious masters, punished for small mistakes. The evidence swings both ways, leaving us to imagine a spectrum that ranged from bearable to unbearable. You wander into the master's private study. A secretary bends over a scroll, scratching notes while his master dictates. His Greek accent lingers on each word, betraying the world he once came from. The boy at his side sharpens reed pens, wood shavings piling at his feet. You feel the hush of concentration, broken only by the occasional sigh of frustration. Knowledge was power in Rome, but here it's pressed into the service of someone else's ambition. Even in the bedroom wing, slavery hums beneath the surface. A maid folds linens, another lays out a tunic for tomorrow, while yet another stokes a brazier for warmth. You think of how private these spaces feel in modern life. Your bed, your clothes, your mess. And then realize that in Rome, privacy was a luxury even masters rarely had. Someone was always there, silently maintaining the illusion of effortless ease. And because humans can't resist turning even servitude into hierarchy, households often had layers of rank among slaves. A senior steward might supervise dozens of others, enjoying privileges that bordered on authority. Some even carried the keys to storerooms or vaults, trusted with their master's wealth. Imagine the temptation and the tightrope walk of holding power without freedom. One misstep, and that trust could vanish like smoke. You pause at a doorway and overhear laughter. In a side chamber, a group of maids trade whispered jokes while mending clothes. The sound is startling, a bubble of life in a world of duty. For a moment, you realize that even within chains, people found slivers of joy. Inside jokes, friendships, little rebellions of spirit. And then, as footsteps approach, the laughter snaps off, replaced by busy silence. As twilight settles, the villa glows with lamplight. Dinner is served on gleaming platters, Cups of spiced wine are poured, and the master entertains guests in the triclinium. Slaves hover like shadows, waiting to refill plates or wipe spills. One trips slightly, earns a glare, and you feel the tension ripple through the room. But the music resumes, conversation flows, and the smooth facade holds. You slip out into the cool night air, glancing back at the villa lit like a jewel against the dark. It looks serene from the outside, but now you know the truth. Every shining stone, every fragrant dish, every soft cushion rests on the shoulders of dozens of unseen workers. And tomorrow before dawn, they'll rise and do it all again. The villa's lamplight fades as you drift down dusty roads toward the countryside. The air feels heavier here, carrying the scent of soil and sweat. You've left behind marble courtyards and scented lapdogs, stepping instead into the vast estates that fed Rome's belly and coffers. This is where slavery shed any illusion of refinement. Fields and mines, the raw engine of empire. Dawn cracks, and you find yourself on a sprawling latifundium, a massive agricultural estate. Rows of vines stretch across hillsides, while olive trees cast long shadows. Slaves already move among them, backs bent, tools in hand. Their day began before sunrise and will end long after you've yawned yourself to bed. One mainstream fact: by the late Republic, small free farms were collapsing under pressure, replaced by these giant estates run almost entirely on slave labor. Bread and circuses may have entertained Rome, but wheat and wine kept it alive. The overseer, grim-faced, a staff in hand, paces along the rows, barking commands. You can almost feel his eyes on you, ready to snap if you slack off. Slaves hoe furrows, prune vines, carry baskets so heavy their shoulders sag. The rhythm is relentless, no room for dawdling. If someone falters, the crack of a whip cuts the morning air. You shiver, realizing that for many here, there's no end date to this sentence. And it isn't just farms. You descend into the mines and the light vanishes almost instantly. The air is damp, thick, and smells of earth and despair. Slaves crouch in narrow tunnels, swinging picks by lamplight, sweat streaking their soot-stained faces. The work is dangerous. Shafts collapse, air runs thin, tools slip. Some miners are chained to their spots, forced to chip at rock until their bodies give out. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman mines were so brutal that some were staffed almost entirely by condemned criminals, considered too worthless to waste anywhere else. Imagine your punishment being a life sentence underground, with sunlight as rare as vacation days in a stingy office job. You crouch, listening to the clang of metal echo through stone. The sound is steady, almost hypnotic, but you know the cost. Miners often died young, their lungs ruined, their backs broken. Yet the empire craved metals, gold, silver, iron, and these tunnels fed that hunger. Rome's glittering temples and coinage came at the price of human misery buried deep underground. Historians still argue whether agricultural slaves or mining slaves had the harsher lot. Some suggest that fieldwork, while exhausting, at least gave you fresh air and a horizon. Others point out that mines consumed lives so quickly they made fields look like luxury. It's a grim competition where nobody really wins. You rise back into daylight, blinking at the harsh sun. A threshing floor spreads before you, where grain is pounded and winnowed. Dust fills the air like a choking fog. Slaves cough, eyes watering, as they toss and pound hour after hour. You wipe grit from your face and wonder how lungs survive this. The overseer's whip cracks again, not just for punishment, but as rhythm. Every lash in the air keeps time, driving the work forward. You wonder, did slaves begin to anticipate the sound like a twisted metronome? Work, pause, crack, work. It's mechanical, efficient, and cruel. And yet even here, humanity leaks through the cracks. A pair of workers share a whispered joke as they bundle hay. Another hums a low tune, a rhythm older than Rome itself, carried from a homeland now far away. You catch fragments of culture preserved in song, gesture, superstition, a reminder that even under Rome's crushing weight, individuality refused to vanish completely. Some estates experimented with specialized labor. Skilled vintners oversaw fermentation, coopers crafted barrels, even potters shaped amphorae for storing oil. For those lucky enough to land in such roles, life carried a sliver of purpose beyond raw exhaustion, and yet the profits never flowed their way. They built Rome's wealth, but never shared it. You pause near a rustic shrine at the edge of the fields, where offerings of bread and flowers sit. Slaves sometimes prayed here in stolen moments, pleading for health, strength, or maybe just a gentler overseer. You whisper a thought into the air yourself, though you're not sure which god covers survive one more shift. As the day drags on, the sun scorches overhead. Slaves stumble, sweat drips, dust clings. Breaks are few, meals meager, a bowl of porridge, maybe bread, sometimes olives. Nothing wasted on comfort. You realize this wasn't just labor, it was strategy. By squeezing maximum output with minimal input, Rome built its empire on an economy of exhaustion. The sun finally dips, but the work doesn't stop. Some slaves light torches to continue tasks into the night. Others collapse into crude huts, bodies aching, too tired even for conversation. A low murmur of snores and coughs fills the camp, and you, standing on the edge, feel the weight of it pressing into your chest. You glance back toward Rome's glowing skyline in the distance. Its marble temples, its bustling forms, its triumphant arches, they all gleam a little less bright now. Because you know the truth. Every stone, every loaf, every cup of wine is soaked in the sweat of those bent-back figures fading into the dark. The countryside fades behind you, and the low hum of farmland gives way to a roar. It's the kind of roar that rattles your chest, the sound of thousands of Romans packed into stone seats, hungry for blood and spectacle. You blink at the blinding sunlight pouring into the Colosseum, and suddenly you're swept into another world where slavery didn't mean drudgery. It meant entertainment, survival, and maybe, just maybe, stardom. Gladiators. The word alone sends a shiver down your spine. You watch as the gates creak open and men stride into the arena, weapons flashing. The crowd surges to its feet, chanting names. But here's the thing. Most of these warriors didn't volunteer. They were slaves, purchased specifically to fight, trained like racehorses and thrown into combat for their master's profit. One mainstream fact: gladiator schools, called ludi, were scattered across the empire, with the largest in Capua. They housed, trained, and disciplined hundreds at a time, transforming terrified captives into hardened fighters. You trail into one of these schools in your imagination. The smell of sweat, leather, and iron hits hard. Slaves practice with wooden swords, drilling footwork until blisters bleed. Trainers shout, correcting stances, punishing mistakes. Meals are heavy on beans and barley, meant to bulk up the body. Gladiators were sometimes nicknamed barley men. You can't help but smirk at the thought. All those muscles fueled by what's basically ancient hummus. But not all gladiators were doomed to die. That's a modern misconception. Many fought multiple times, carefully managed by their owners, because a skilled gladiator was far more valuable alive than dead. Owners gambled on them, audiences adored them, and some even gained fan clubs. Imagine graffiti scrawled on Roman walls. "Crescens the Thracian is the delight of the girls." Yes, ancient fangirling was very much a thing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Gladiators sometimes became sex symbols. Women of high rank were rumored to swoon over them, even sneaking into their barracks. The irony? Gladiators were legally considered infames, disgraced outside proper society. Yet their very disgrace made them magnetic, like ancient rock stars who also happened to occasionally stab each other. The arena wasn't the only stage for enslaved entertainers. You wander into a Roman theater, where another kind of slave performs. Actors, musicians, dancers, all often slaves or freedmen, brought myths and comedies to life. The audience laughed, jeered, or wept, but the performers had little control over their roles. A flute player might spend decades perfecting his craft, only to be discarded when his master got bored. Still, fame sometimes slipped through. Some performers were so beloved they earned their freedom or even amassed wealth, though always at the whim of those who owned them. Historians still argue how much agency these entertainers truly had. Were gladiators and actors prisoners trapped in a cruel system? Or did some carve out genuine identities and influence? The sources hint at both, fear and exploitation, but also strange pockets of power for those who survived long enough. Back in the arena, the fight intensifies. Two gladiators circle, one with a net and trident, the other with a short sword and shield. The crowd roars at every feint, every strike. Dust swirls, sweat flies, and you realize how choreographed it feels. Not faked, but structured. Matches were often designed to pair different styles, maximizing drama. The Romans knew how to put on a show. You flinch as a sword finds its mark, and the wounded man drops to his knees. The crowd howls, thumbs turning this way and that. You glance at the editor, the sponsor of the games, waiting for the final signal. Mercy or death. You can almost hear the heartbeat of the defeated man, every muscle trembling as he waits. At last, the editor spares him. Relief floods the arena, mixed with disappointment from bloodthirsty fans. Entertainment balanced on the edge of life and death. And while gladiators might grab the spotlight, remember that many slaves supported the games from the shadows. Crews of enslaved workers hauled props, staged mock naval battles by flooding the arena, even dressed as mythological creatures for grotesque reenactments. Imagine drawing the short straw and being shoved into a lion costume without the part where you get to go home afterward. You linger as the crowd spills into the streets, buzzing with gossip about today's matches. Merchants hawk souvenirs, tiny oil lamps stamped with gladiators' images, like action figures for grown-ups. Fans argue which fighters are overrated, while children swing sticks pretending to duel. The line between slavery and celebrity blurs here, leaving you with a strange taste in your mouth. The sun dips, casting long shadows across the Colosseum's arches. Somewhere inside, the gladiators limp back to their barracks, some triumphant, others bruised, all still bound by chains, invisible or otherwise. Their names may echo in chants, but their lives remain tethered to the whims of Rome's appetite for spectacle. And as you drift away from the arena, the roar fades into a memory. You realize that for some slaves, survival meant blending into a household or a field. For others, it meant stepping into the spotlight, gambling each breath against the crowd's cheers. Either way, the empire always won. The echo of the arena still lingers in your ears, but now the sound softens. No more roaring crowds, just the hush of silk curtains swaying and the faint clink of glass bottles filled with oil and perfume. You step quietly into the world of body servants and luxury, where slaves lived in the intimate orbit of Rome's elite. It smells of rosewater, olive oil, and maybe just a little arrogance. Here, slaves weren't anonymous figures, bent over plows or hidden in mines. Instead, they moved silently through marble halls, adjusting togas, arranging jewelry, curling hair, and whispering advice in their master's ear. One mainstream fact: wealthy Romans often owned dozens of these personal attendants, each trained for a specific task. One to dress the lady of the house, another to fan her while she dined, another to memorize her schedule, and yes, even one whose whole job was to remind her of names at parties. Imagine introducing yourself, and the person across from you has a living, breathing Rolodex at their elbow. You watch as a young maid sprinkles powdered incense into a bronze censer. Across the room, a slave massages fragrant oil into his master's skin, working out knots after a long day in the Forum. Luxury in Rome wasn't just about marble villas. It was about being so rich you never had to touch your own sandal straps. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some Romans got so extravagant that they trained slaves to do things like hold mirrors at just the right flattering angle, or even taste food multiple times. Not to check for poison, but to confirm the seasoning was perfectly balanced. If you've ever sent back fries for not being salty enough, congratulations. You've just had your patrician moment. But luxury came with trust, and trust was risky. These body slaves overheard private conversations, saw their masters at their most vulnerable, and sometimes became confidants. Letters mentioned trusted attendants who advised their masters in politics or business, yet they were still property. At any moment, they could be sold, punished, or traded away like furniture. Historians still argue whether this closeness offered a real chance at influence, or whether it was just another illusion of agency dangling above chains. In the women's quarters, the bustle is constant. One slave braids intricate hairstyles, her fingers flying faster than your eyes can follow. Another powders her mistress's face with chalky white cosmetics, while a third adjusts pins and jewels until the gown sits perfectly. The mistress sighs, sipping watered wine, while her attendants hover like anxious bees. You notice how little space there is for mistakes. If a pin pricks too sharply or a braid is uneven, punishment might follow. Beauty for the elite was maintained on the backs of nervous, unseen hands. Meanwhile, in the men's quarters, body servants polish bronze cuirasses or sharpen writing style, depending on whether the day calls for Senate or battlefield. A master stretches lazily, dictating a letter while a slave scribes the words in neat lines on wax tablets. The scribe pauses, asking if a certain phrase should be reworded. It's a dangerous kind of intimacy. Slaves often became the first to read, and sometimes even shape their master's thoughts. The strangest part? Despite their proximity to wealth, many of these slaves lived in cramped quarters, just steps away from lavish rooms they could never truly inhabit. You peek into a tiny cubicle tucked behind the atrium, little more than a wooden bunk. Luxury in Rome had a cruel sense of humor. To be surrounded by golden marble, yet never own even a chipped cup. You pause at a banquet scene. Guests recline on couches, sipping wine, while a stream of body slaves keeps the evening smooth. One refills cups, another wipes spills, a third plucks away empty plates with the grace of a dancer. Somewhere in the corner, a boy fans the air tirelessly, his arm aching though no one notices. The guests laugh at witty toasts, oblivious to the quiet choreography keeping their comfort intact. Sometimes closeness meant danger. Stories whisper of slaves plotting assassinations, slipping poison into drinks, or betraying secrets overheard at night. The paranoia ran deep. Owners both relied on and feared their attendants. Trust a slave to dress you, but never forget they're close enough to slip a knife between your ribs. You shift uncomfortably, realizing that intimacy and vulnerability walked hand in hand in Roman luxury. And then, the absurd detail that sticks with you. Some masters even had designated ear slaves, trained to stand silently and listen, just so gossip or insults wouldn't be lost. Imagine your boss hiring someone just to remember that embarrassing joke you made last week and replay it at the worst possible time. Still, for a handful of lucky attendants, this closeness opened a path to freedom. A trusted body servant could be manumitted as a reward for loyalty, stepping into life as a freedman with connections and skills that other slaves could only dream of. A freed hairdresser or secretary might even open a business, riding on their former master's patronage. Night falls in the villa, and you catch the soft glow of oil lamps. The mistress leans back as her hair is unpinned, her gown loosened, her jewelry stored. The master yawns, dictating last instructions before sleep. Around them, body slaves move quietly. Ghosts of luxury. They adjust covers, smooth pillows, extinguish lamps. And when the household finally rests, these slaves retreat to their cubicles, shadows fading into silence. You exhale slowly, realizing how strange it feels. The minds reeked of despair, the fields of exhaustion, the arena of blood. But here in the cushioned heart of Roman wealth, slavery smelled like roses, oils, and freshly pressed linen. Yet it was still slavery, chains wrapped in silk. The perfume lingers in your nostrils as the villa fades. But now the scent shifts, ink, wax, and parchment. You find yourself in a quiet study where lamps glow against shelves of scrolls. Here, slavery isn't about brute strength or even polishing sandals. Instead, it's about brains. These are the clever and the educated, the slaves who could read, calculate, write, and sometimes outthink their masters. You glance at a young man hunched over a wax tablet, stylus scratching in neat practice strokes. He's a literatus, a literate slave, one of the most valuable investments a Roman might own. One mainstream fact: educated Greek slaves were particularly prized, often purchased at high cost to serve as tutors, secretaries, or philosophers. Many of Rome's elite wanted their children schooled in Greek language and literature. And who better than a captive from Athens or Rhodes? Imagine sending your kids to private school, except the teacher lives in your attic and can't quit. Some of these slaves became walking libraries, capable of reciting Homer, quoting law, or composing letters on demand. In a culture where literacy was far from universal, Their skills turned them into status symbols. To boast that your household had a tutor from Greece was like flashing the latest iPhone, except, well, the phone had opinions and a pulse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some wealthy Romans used educated slaves as reminder machines. One master supposedly had a slave whisper in his ear throughout the day. Not about groceries or emails, but about philosophy, nudging him to stay virtuous or disciplined. Imagine having a live motivational podcast trailing you everywhere, minus the pause button. Of course, tutoring and secretarial work weren't the only intellectual roles. Some educated slaves managed finances, recording debts, rents, and trades. These men, often called dispensatores, handled so much money that, in some cases, they practically ran the estate. Their masters trusted them with ledgers and strongboxes, which meant they also had opportunities to, let's say, redistribute resources creatively. There are scattered accounts of slaves embezzling or skimming funds, only to later buy their freedom with the very coins they'd siphoned. Historians still argue whether this was widespread corruption or just a few daring outliers, but either way, it shows brains could sometimes beat chains. You tilt your head toward another room where a boy recites Homer in trembling tones. The tutor paces, correcting his pronunciation, reminding him to lift his voice. For the child, it's education. For the tutor, it's survival. Misstep too often, and punishment waits. Not for the boy, but for the slave who failed to teach him properly. Pressure hangs in the air, heavier than the smell of lamp oil. And then there were the doctors. Some slaves, trained in medicine, became indispensable. Owners relied on them for everything from setting bones to mixing herbs. A skilled physician slave might even be loaned out for a fee, turning healing into profit. Yet no matter how many lives they saved, their own freedom was never guaranteed. The irony drips thick. You could be trusted to cut a tumor from your master's body, but never to walk away from his house. The line between trusted intellect and disposable tool was razor thin. You picture a secretary slave composing speeches for a senator, maybe even slipping in clever turns of phrase that win applause in the forum. The crowd cheers, the senator beams, and the slave stays in the shadows. Nameless, his brilliance claimed by another. Still, the mind offered a peculiar shield. An educated slave had value that made rash punishment less likely. Beating a field hand might go unnoticed, but breaking your tutor's fingers? That was like smashing your laptop with a hammer. Reckless, expensive, and deeply inconvenient. You find yourself smirking at the thought of Roman children trying to skip lessons. Did they ever groan, Greek verbs again? While their teacher quietly suppressed the urge to roll his eyes and remind them he'd once lectured in a proper city before being dragged here? Kids whining about homework. It's a tradition older than Rome itself. Even within this intellectual world, tension simmered. Some slaves genuinely bonded with their pupils, forging ties that sometimes lasted into adulthood. Freedmen tutors occasionally became trusted advisors or family friends. Others nursed quiet resentment, pouring out frustration in whispered complaints or, in rare cases, outright sabotage. The relationship was always a gamble, affection balancing on the edge of power. The study grows quiet, scrolls tucked away, lamps flickering low. You imagine the slaves retreating to their tiny quarters, heads buzzing with poetry, numbers, and half-written letters. Their world wasn't filled with sweat or blood, but with ink stains and mental strain. Luxury slaves served with their hands. These served with their minds. And yet both shared the same truth. Intelligence didn't erase the chains. A clever slave might earn his freedom faster, but he was still property until the very moment he wasn't. Freedom was a carrot dangling just out of reach, and brains, like muscles, were simply another commodity to be bought, sold, or worn down. You step back into the corridor, the rustle of scrolls fading. The contrast strikes you: fields, mines, arenas, bedrooms, and now libraries. Slavery in Rome wasn't one shape, it was 100, each more unsettling than the last. The smell of ink and wax fades, and now the air feels sharp, metallic, intense. You sense dread thick in the shadows, as if the walls themselves remember screams. Tonight you're walking straight into the hardest part of the story: punishment and rebellion, where Rome's system of slavery revealed its teeth. Picture it, a courtyard at dawn, slaves lined up as the overseer inspects them. Someone broke a tool yesterday, or maybe stole a crust of bread. The master strides out, his face calm in a way that makes your stomach turn. Punishment in Rome wasn't just about correcting mistakes, it was theater, a way to remind everyone else who held the power. One mainstream fact: slaves could be beaten, branded, or shackled at their owner's whim. The law offered almost no protection. A master might even kill his slave outright, though by the later empire this drew more criticism than in earlier times. You watch as a man is tied to a post. The lash cracks again and again until his back runs with welts. The others don't dare look away. Discipline wasn't just about the victim, it was about the audience. Fear was Rome's insurance policy, renewable with every stroke of the whip. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some owners tattooed or branded their slaves with "I belong to so-and-so" on their foreheads, like a grotesque name tag. Imagine walking through the market with "Property of Marcus" permanently carved across your skin. It was humiliation turned into a fashion statement for the elite, but cruelty carried consequences. Push too far, and even the most broken souls might fight back. The most famous? Spartacus. You probably know the name, but standing here in your imagination, you feel the heat of it. The gladiator slave who in 73 BCE led a revolt that shook the Republic to its knees. He and his band of gladiators escaped their training school with kitchen knives in a desperate plan, gathering tens of thousands of runaway slaves as they stormed across Italy. You see them, ragged men and women trailing behind him, carrying stolen weapons, swelling into an army. For 2 years, they humiliated Roman legions, winning battle after battle. Imagine the Senate, those smug marble pillars of power, suddenly quaking because the very people they considered property were marching in formation against them. Historians still argue whether Spartacus truly dreamed of marching everyone back to freedom beyond the Alps, or whether the rebellion fractured under conflicting goals. Some suggest he wanted a full-scale exodus. Others think survival was the only plan. Either way, the vision terrified Rome, and Rome responded the way empires always do, with overwhelming force. In the end, Spartacus fell in battle, and the survivors were captured. What happened next still makes your skin crawl. Along the Appian Way, 6,000 slaves were crucified, their bodies lining the road for miles, a grotesque warning to anyone else tempted to rebel. You imagine walking that road, shadows stretching over countless crosses. Even the crows would have grown tired of the feast. Not every rebellion was so massive. Small revolts broke out in households, fields, or ships. A poisoned cup here, a nighttime escape there. Owners lived with constant paranoia, never sure which servant smiling behind them might be plotting their downfall. Some historians argue this fear was baked into Roman culture itself. Why else invest so heavily in punishment, unless they knew resistance was always simmering just below the surface? You pause, listening to the uneasy silence after a punishment in the courtyard. Whispers ripple through the slave quarters that night. About Spartacus, about smaller rebellions no one wrote down, about escape attempts across forests or seas. You realize rebellion wasn't always grand or bloody. Sometimes it was subtle, working slower, breaking tools accidentally, hiding supplies. Resistance took many forms, some visible, some invisible, all risky. And then there's the cruelest paradox. Owners relied on terror to control their slaves, but terror itself fed rebellion. The harsher the lash, the hotter the fire smoldering beneath. Rome tried to balance this, sometimes rewarding loyalty with small comforts, other times wielding the whip like a god's lightning. It was a balancing act performed on the backs of human beings. You shiver as you picture that Appian Way again, lined with crosses in the fading sunset. The message was clear: rebellion ends here. But history whispers louder. Rebellion never really ends. It hides, waits, shifts shape. Even chained, the human spirit keeps testing the links, tugging at them, daring them to snap. The image of the Appian Way dissolves, and the harsh clang of chains fades. In its place, you hear the rustle of parchment, the murmur of contracts, and strangest of all, laughter. You've stepped into the uncertain, bittersweet world of manumission. The moment when slavery ended for some, though never without strings attached. You picture a slave kneeling before his master, heart racing. A crowd gathers, family, neighbors, maybe even other slaves. The master speaks a few solemn words, lays a hand on the kneeling figure, and just like that, a person once considered property becomes free. One mainstream fact: Rome had a highly developed system for freeing slaves, with ceremonies ranging from formal rituals before a magistrate to casual declarations at a banquet. Freedom wasn't rare. Estimates suggest that in certain periods, tens of thousands of slaves were freed across the empire. But here's the kicker. Manumission didn't just spring from kindness. Often it was transactional. Some slaves saved coins, tips, small wages, or secret earnings, and bought their freedom. Others earned it by loyal service, clever management, or simply aging into usefulness as clients rather than as property. Rome's elites loved surrounding themselves with freedmen who owed them everything. It was like creating your own permanent fan club. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some ceremonies, a master would symbolically tap the slave with a rod, almost like knighting them. Congratulations, you've gone from property to personhood, all thanks to a gentle boop on the head. The life of a freedman, libertus, wasn't exactly carefree. Yes, they gained legal rights, could marry, own property, even start businesses, but obligations lingered. Freedmen were tied to their former masters as patrons. That meant services, favors, and sometimes outright groveling whenever the patron called. Freedom came with invisible strings, like canceling your gym membership, but still getting harassing emails forever. You wander into a bustling street in Ostia, Rome's port city. Shops line the road and you realize many are run by freedmen. Bakers, ship captains, cloth merchants, all once slaves, now independent entrepreneurs. Some even grew rich, richer than their old masters, which made elite Romans grit their teeth. You can almost hear the snide remarks in dinner parties. Oh, that Libertus owns half the grain market? How charming. Historians still argue just how socially mobile freedmen truly were. On one hand, inscriptions boast of ex-slaves who rose to prominence, funding temples or sponsoring games. On the other, prejudice never really faded. Freedmen could never hold high political office, and old families sneered at their lowly origins. The tension between legal freedom and social stigma was constant, like being invited to the party but never allowed near the VIP couch. Some freedmen carved their names into stone. Literally, tomb inscriptions often proudly announced, "So-and-so, freedman of Marcus." Imagine being so tied to your ex-boss that you tattoo his name onto your gravestone. It was both badge of honor and permanent reminder. Freedom came from another man's hand, not from the gods or the law alone. But not every story was bitter. Freedmen sometimes became fiercely loyal to their patrons, grateful for the chance at dignity. They could marry, raise children, and pass down property, things impossible under slavery. For the first time, the future wasn't just about surviving tomorrow's lash. It stretched into years, decades, generations. You glance into a cramped but lively home. A freed woman stitches cloth while her husband, once a house slave, tallies accounts. Their children chatter in Latin, not marked by chains, born free citizens of Rome. That's the miracle. Within a single lifetime, the cycle could break. Freedom wasn't just personal, it was generational. Still, shadows linger. Some freedmen remained under their patrons' thumbs, unable to escape the obligations that came with manumission. Others found themselves mocked, never fully accepted by society. Rome loved using their talents but hated sharing status. You can almost hear the whispers in the forum. Yes, he funds games, but remember, his father was a slave. Night settles, and you picture a freedman lying awake, staring at his ceiling. He's no longer a slave, but neither is he fully equal. Freedom is sweet, but complicated, half a gift, half a bargain, never pure. And yet, compared to the darkness of chains, even a complicated freedom glows like a lantern in the night. The lantern glow of a freedman's home flickers out, and suddenly you're back in the cold, rigid light of Roman law. Marble tablets gleam, clerks scratch notes, and the sound of sandals echoes through courtrooms. Tonight, you walk among rules and loopholes, discovering how Rome wrapped slavery in a web of legal codes. Codes that could both sharpen cruelty and, oddly enough, carve out strange exceptions. One mainstream fact: Roman law classified slaves not as people, but as property res. Things like a jug or a plow. That meant an owner had nearly absolute power. He could sell, punish, even kill his slave, and the law shrugged. In early Rome, a slave was little more than a living tool, cataloged alongside cattle. You can almost hear the lawyers dryly debating whether a broken slave counted as damaged goods, as if he were a cracked amphora. But reality wasn't always that simple. Over time, laws evolved, tugged by practicality and philosophy. By the late Empire, outright killing a slave was frowned upon, even punished in certain cases. Owners were urged, though not forced, to show restraint. It was less about mercy and more about preserving valuable assets. After all, a dead slave didn't harvest wheat or polish silver. Here's a quirky tidbit. Rome had laws forbidding slaves from wearing the toga, the garment of free citizens. It sounds straightforward, but the real reason wasn't modesty or fashion policing, it was fear. If every slave in Rome dressed like a citizen, nobody could tell them apart. Picture a society where 500,000 enslaved people suddenly blended into the crowd. Paranoia would skyrocket faster than you can say revolt. In the courts, things get knotty. Could a slave testify? Yes, but only under torture. The logic was twisted. Slaves couldn't be trusted to tell the truth unless pain squeezed it out of them. You picture a courtroom scene where a trembling slave is dragged aside, beaten until his words spill out. Justice in Rome wasn't blind. It squinted, and usually at the expense of the vulnerable. Historians still argue whether Roman law was ever sincerely concerned with slaves' well-being, or whether reforms were just clever ways to maintain control. Was the empire softening, or simply adjusting the screws? The evidence runs both ways. Some emperors issued decrees urging humane treatment, but at the same time, runaway slaves could be branded on the forehead, their punishment a permanent advertisement of disobedience. And speaking of runaways, Roman law even created an entire job category: the slave catcher. Owners could post notices describing fugitives, height, scars, accents, and offer rewards. Imagine walking through town and seeing what was basically an ancient wanted poster, except instead of criminals, it listed the baker's assistant who dared to slip away. If caught, the runaway often endured torture or branding before being chained again. Yet even in this rigid system, loopholes sprouted. Some masters used laws of manumission not only to free loyal slaves, but also to curry political favor, parading their generosity in public ceremonies. Freedmen, in turn, were bound by legal obligations of loyalty to their patrons, ensuring the system still served the elite. Freedom was structured, not absolute. And then there were odd exceptions. Some slaves served as priests in foreign cults or temple attendants, blurring the line between sacred and servile. Roman law allowed it, though always with caveats, reminding everyone that holiness didn't cancel ownership. Imagine being chained, but also expected to channel divine will. It's like being both janitor and prophet at the same time. You lean into the buzz of the forum, where lawyers debate cases involving inheritance, contracts, and disputes over slaves. Was this boy truly sold, or was the deal fraudulent? Did that freed woman owe extra service to her patron? The law tangled itself around every corner of slavery, trying to codify something fundamentally dehumanizing. And still, loopholes kept slipping through, like water through cracked marble. Night falls and the court closes. You step back, staring at the stone tablets inscribed with laws. They gleam with authority but feel hollow. The words may sound precise, but beneath them lies the chaos of human lives. Laughter, tears, pain, rebellion that no law could truly contain. Rome tried to legislate chains, but chains don't obey logic. They clink, they strain, and eventually they break. The clang of legal chains drifts away, and you now feel the hush of incense curling in temple air, the murmur of philosophers under colonnades, and the faint whisper of prayers in catacombs. Tonight you're brushing against something slipperier than law. Ideas. Religion and philosophy in Rome tangled with slavery, sometimes excusing it, sometimes challenging it, often just muddling around in contradiction. Picture yourself leaning against a pillar while a Stoic philosopher lectures. His toga is simple, his words measured. All men are brothers, he proclaims. Slavery is only of the body, the mind remains free. One mainstream fact: Stoicism, especially under thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus, often frames slavery as a condition of circumstance, not of essence. Epictetus himself was born a slave, yet became one of the greatest teachers of freedom. Not freedom from chains, but freedom of the soul. You nod slowly, though part of you wants to raise a hand and ask, "Sure, but does that help the guy in chains over there?" Meanwhile, religion swirled with its own contradictions. Traditional Roman religion didn't bat an eye at slavery. Offerings to Jupiter never came with footnotes about emancipation. Slavery was simply part of cosmic order, as ordinary as sunrise. Priests themselves might own slaves who polished altars and carried ritual tools. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some mystery cults, like that of ISIS, welcome slaves and free people alike into their secret rites. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in candlelight, chanting sacred hymns, your status outside the temple momentarily erased. For a few hours, you weren't property, you were a worshiper, equal before the goddess. Then there were the Christians, huddled in catacombs, whispering prayers under threat of persecution. Early Christian texts sometimes called for obedience. Slaves, obey your masters, but also spoke of a radical equality in Christ, where there was neither slave nor free. Historians still argue whether Christianity offered real liberation for slaves or simply spiritualized their chains. Did it plant seeds of later abolition, or did it just keep people docile until the afterlife? The debate lingers, unresolved. You drift into a crowded forum where Cicero's words echo. He rails about justice, virtue, and natural law, but even he never seriously suggested ending slavery. For Roman elites, philosophy was often more about smoothing their conscience than reforming society. It was easier to claim slavery was natural than to face the economic earthquake abolition would bring. And yet, under the surface, doubt flickered. A master who'd studied Stoicism might hesitate before striking a slave, muttering about inner dignity. A Christian matron might free a trusted servant in her will, hoping it pleased God. These were sparks, not bonfires, but they glowed in the darkness. You pass into a shaded garden where Epicureans debate. They shrug off slavery as another fact of life, but advise treating slaves kindly, since cruelty disrupts household harmony. Kindness not as morality, but as stress management. Imagine an ancient self-help book titled, How Not to Annoy Your Butler to Death. Still, religion and philosophy provided language, metaphors, and cracks in the system. Even as temples blessed wars that filled slave markets, other voices whispered that chains were unnatural. Even as senators toasted prosperity, sects like Christianity declared that God favored the lowly. The contradiction hummed everywhere. Acceptance and resistance braided together. Night deepens. You picture a slave praying quietly in his corner, clutching a small charm of Isis, or tracing a cross in dust, or remembering Epictetus's words that freedom lives in the mind. Philosophy couldn't snap iron, and prayers didn't unfasten manacles. But they gave hope, and sometimes hope was the sharpest tool smuggled into bondage. You breathe in the incense, heavy and sweet, and realize something. Law tried to trap slaves in contracts. Philosophy tried to soothe their existence. Religion tried to give it meaning. None could erase the reality, but all three added layers of noise around the chains, making them harder and sometimes easier to bear. The incense fades, the temple whispers dissolve, and you're swept into the glittering corridors of Roman imagination. Statues loom, poets chant, mosaics glitter under torchlight. Tonight, you aren't eavesdropping on lawyers or priests. You're peeking into the minds of Rome's artists and writers, the people who embroidered slavery into the cultural fabric, sometimes as casual background, sometimes as biting commentary. You start in a villa's atrium, walls painted with frescoes. Servants bustle through the scene, carrying trays, fetching water, standing silently at the edges of banquets. In art, slaves often appear not as individuals, but as living props, decorations that set off the wealth of their masters. One mainstream fact: Roman mosaics and wall paintings frequently depicted slaves in domestic service, reinforcing their role as part of the household's identity. A wealthy Roman didn't just own couches and silverware. He owned human beings to complete the aesthetic, but literature had sharper edges. Satirists like Juvenal skewered the hypocrisy of elites who claimed dignity while humiliating their slaves. In one of his works, he sneers about dinner parties where guests mock the servants, reminding you that cruelty wasn't hidden, it was entertainment. And then there's Petronius, whose wild Satyricon paints freedmen as vulgar climbers, caught between servitude and snobbery. Roman audiences laughed, but you can sense the unease beneath the jokes. Nobody was entirely comfortable with how fluid those boundaries could be. Here's a quirky tidbit. Comedic plays from earlier centuries, like those of Plautus, often featured clever slave characters outsmarting their masters. Imagine the audience roaring with laughter as a servant tricks a pompous Roman into handing over money or making a fool of himself. Comedy gave slaves a voice, though a fictional, exaggerated one. For 2 hours in the theater, the social order flipped, and slaves became the stars. Then the curtain fell, and reality clamped back into place. Historians still argue how much Roman audiences took those plays seriously. Were they just silly entertainment, or did they reflect unease about real servitude? Was laughter a safe release valve for tension, or a quiet rebellion dressed in jokes? No ancient critic left us a clear answer, so you're left squinting at the mosaics and wondering. Poetry, too, weaves slavery into its stanzas. Horace, himself the son of a freedman, sometimes nodded toward his humble roots while mingling with the elite. Martial, ever the snarky epigrammatist, sprinkled jokes about slaves into his verses, equal parts casual cruelty and sharp-eyed observation. Literature became a mirror, sometimes mocking, sometimes sympathetic, always reminding readers that slavery sat at the heart of Roman life. You wander into the library of Alexandria's Roman wing, scrolls piled high. Historians record prices, laws, revolts, but poets capture moods. The sigh of a slave sweeping marble floors, the humiliation of a servant cuffed in public, the faint pride of a freedman buying his child an education. Fiction turned what law ignored into stories that stuck in people's minds. Visual art pushed contradictions too. Some sarcophagi depict slaves mourning their masters, suggesting loyalty, or perhaps just artistic convention. Others show slaves in erotic contexts, reminders of how servitude fed Rome's appetite for domination in every sphere. The art is beautiful, unsettling, sometimes both at once, like a silk curtain hiding iron chains. And then there's Virgil. In the Aeneid, slavery doesn't dominate the stage, but the epic's themes of conquest and subjugation echo the system that Rome thrived upon. Every city Aeneas conquers, every people absorbed into empire, implies the creation of new slaves. Poetry about destiny quietly doubles as propaganda for the machine that fueled it. You pass through a workshop where artisans carve ivory. They etch scenes of victories, chained captives trudging behind generals. These aren't subtle, they're bragging. Rome loved to celebrate conquest in stone, reminding everyone that its power rested on defeated peoples bound into slavery. Art wasn't neutral. It reinforced pride in domination. Still, contradictions gleam. The clever slave in comedy, the freedman poet in satire, the murmuring servant in mosaics. They all hint that the system wasn't airtight. Culture both affirmed and needled at the status quo, holding up a mirror that Romans sometimes laughed at, sometimes squirmed before. Night settles, and you stand in a grand atrium, frescoes glowing under torchlight. Slaves painted on the walls gaze back at you with blank expressions. Were they decorative, symbolic, or quiet reminders of Rome's dependence on bondage? You can't be sure. Art leaves questions sharper than answers, and maybe that's the point. The torchlight fades, fresco faces blur, and suddenly you're standing not in a Roman villa, but in the quiet ruins they left behind. Stones crumble under your feet. Weeds grow through cracked mosaics, and the voices of slaves seem to echo faintly, carried by wind across centuries. Tonight, the story bends toward endings. How slavery in Rome didn't vanish overnight, but dissolved, shifted, and reshaped itself into new forms as the empire crumbled. One mainstream fact: slavery in Rome declined gradually, not through a dramatic abolition, but through slow economic and social transformations. By the late Empire, invasions disrupted the endless supply of war captives. The cost of acquiring slaves rose, while alternative labor systems like tenant farming or colony spread. Instead of outright slavery, peasants tied to the land began to replace chained workers. You can almost see the gears turning. Rome's machine wasn't stopping, it was rewiring. But here's a quirky tidbit. Even as the Western Empire collapsed, some wealthy landowners still kept personal slaves, chefs, tutors, entertainers, long after mass agricultural slavery faded. Imagine a feasting hall in the 5th century, half empty because the countryside has been ravaged by invasions, yet a handful of servants still polish goblets, relics of an older order. Historians still argue whether the rise of Christianity helped accelerate slavery's decline. Some point to bishops and emperors issuing laws restricting cruelty or encouraging manumission. Others note that Christians continued to own slaves for centuries, simply baptizing them alongside their masters. Was faith a catalyst for change, or just another layer of justification? The debate lingers, unresolved. You wander through the shadow of a broken aqueduct, hearing whispers of continuity. The medieval system of serfdom, peasants bound to land, not chains, looks suspiciously like a cousin of Roman slavery. It wasn't freedom, not really. It was just a reshaped bargain. Labor tied not to the lash, but to obligation and rent. Rome's ghost lingered in every furrow of soil tilled by medieval hands. In the East, the Byzantine Empire carried Roman slavery forward in modified ways, using household slaves and servants even as large-scale plantation labor faded. And later, when Europe expanded into the Atlantic world, echoes of Rome's system resurfaced with brutal clarity. Ships crossed seas carrying chained human cargo, as if the lessons of antiquity had been not to end slavery, but to perfect it on a larger, crueler scale. You pause among the ruins, listening. The wind carries laughter, groans, bargains, prayers, the sounds of countless lives once caught in chains. The system was enormous, crushing, yet never total. Some found freedom, some rebelled, some left faint inscriptions that still puzzle archaeologists. Rome is gone, but their stories cling like ivy to broken walls. And now, as the night deepens, it's time to let the echoes quiet. Your footsteps slow on the ruined stones, and you breathe out a long, steady sigh. The wind down begins, soft and unhurried, words stretching like shadows at dusk. You settle into gentler rhythms now, letting the weight of history slip from your shoulders. Imagine lying back in the grass near those ruins, the stars glimmering above the dark arches of aqueducts, the silence broken only by crickets. The chains are gone, the markets empty, the law tablets crumbled. Only the night sky remains, wide and calm. You feel the edges of this long journey blur. From the bustling streets of Rome to the hushed chambers of freedmen, from the brutality of the markets to the whispered prayers in catacombs, you've wandered far. The story of Roman slavery wasn't neat, wasn't kind, but it was deeply human, full of contradiction, sorrow, and the occasional flicker of resilience. Let the last images fade now, a freedman's proud gravestone, a comic slave outsmarting his master, a Christian slave singing softly in the dark. They melt into one another, dissolving into silence. Your breathing slows. The words stretch, soften, dim. Sleep draws near, patient and quiet, like a gentle tide pulling at your thoughts. Let the hum of history fade into the background, as if you're floating above time itself, unbound by chains, unbothered by law. Close your eyes. Let the night hold you. Rome is gone, the story is done, and all that remains is the soft drift into dreams.